The bus stop bench is cold, smelling faintly of wet pavement and diesel fumes. WYRMSCALE sits perfectly still, staring at the suburban horizon where the familiar row of oak trees has vanished. In their place, a vertical wall of dark, churning seawater rises miles into the atmosphere, perfectly motionless against the pale blue sky. It does not crash or spray. It simply exists, a towering barrier of salt and depth that dwarfs the neighborhood, turning the afternoon light into a bruised, oceanic violet. A single raindrop, heavy and smelling of deep-sea brine, strikes the top of the glassed shelter. WYRMSCALE watches it slide down the pane, leaving a smear of bioluminescent algae in its wake. The sound of the world has changed. The distant hum of traffic has been replaced by the rhythmic, low-frequency thrum of shifting currents trapped behind that impossible liquid wall. There is no wind, only the heavy, pressurized silence of an abyss pressing against the fragile architecture of the city streets. The asphalt beneath the bus stop begins to spiderweb, fine fissures snaking outward as the ground plate adjusts to the immense weight concentrated just inches behind the concrete wall. A street lamp nearby flickers, then tilts at an unnatural angle as the sidewalk subsides. WYRMSCALE remains seated, hands resting calmly on knees, ignoring the metal groan of the structure above. The structural integrity of the suburb is failing, not through violence, but through the sheer, indifferent gravity of the phenomenon looming behind them. Water begins to weep from the joints where the earth meets the sky. Thin ribbons of foam sliding down the vertical surface to pool against the curb. It is not flooding the street, it is simply displacing reality. A parked sedan across the road vanishes, pulled not by a current, but by the subtle, irresistible suction of the wall's presence. WYRMSCALE reaches down to touch the concrete, feeling the vibrations of a tectonic shift that defies every geological law known to man. WYRMSCALE stands slowly, brushing a speck of gray dust from a dark coat. There is no panic in the movement, only the deliberate grace of someone fulfilling a long-awaited appointment. The air grows frigid, thick with the scent of crushed shells and cold currents. While the few pedestrians left in the vicinity have begun to scatter in terror, WYRMSCALE turns toward the wall of water, eyes tracing the swirling patterns of suspended debris caught within the translucent, crushing weight of the ocean. A commuter bus rounds the corner, its headlights cutting through the darkening haze, unaware of the wall until it is 10 feet away. The driver slams on the brakes, the screech of tires echoing sharply before dying into the damp, heavy air. WYRMSCALE checks the time on a silver watch, noting the exact second the vehicle comes to a halt. Life continues in the shadow of the gargantuan, a frantic, small-scale rhythm playing out against the monumental stillness of the rising sea. The atmosphere is dense enough to taste, a metallic tang that settles on the tongue. WYRMSCALE observes the horizon, noting how the wall is not static. It pulses with a slow, internal luminescence that mimics a heartbeat. Tiny, translucent creatures, deep-sea things never meant for the sun, drift against the glass-like surface, trapped in the membrane between worlds. WYRMSCALE notes their position, observing the way they cluster near the center, acting as a barometer for the pressure building within the massive liquid divide. WYRMSCALE reaches into a deep pocket and pulls out a heavy, lead-lined cylinder, its surface etched with intricate, non-repeating geometric patterns. The metal is freezing, yet it hums with a faint, sympathetic frequency that matches the wall's vibration. With practiced efficiency, WYRMSCALE unscrews the cap, revealing a core of glowing, compressed sand that seems to drink the surrounding light. It was never a question of if the ocean would come, but of whether the anchor would hold when the tide finally arrived. The parking lot stretched out like an altar of cracked asphalt, forgotten by the urban sprawl. WYRMSCALE walked toward the center, where the lights seemed to warp and bleed into the horizon. Years ago, beneath this very slab of concrete, a series of seismic dampeners had been installed, disguised as standard utility conduits. They were never meant for earthquakes or infrastructure failure. They were the silent architects of this moment, buried deep, waiting for the day the sky would fold into the earth. Looking up, the tower that once defined the skyline was gone, its peak swallowed by clouds that hung lower than physics should allow. It had not collapsed, it had been integrated into the rising phenomenon. WYRMSCALE realized then that the blueprints were not for preservation, but for calibration. Every bolt and circuit installed during the construction phase served as a tether, pinning the atmosphere to the ground. The ocean was not arriving to destroy, it was arriving to occupy a space already prepared for its weight. The air grew thick with static, a metallic taste coating the back of WYRMSCALE throat. Shadows of people huddled near the perimeter of the lot, their panic a frantic, buzzing noise against the absolute silence of the encroaching wall of water. The stakes had shifted from survival to containment. If the connection between the subterranean anchors and the atmospheric divide failed, the entire suburb would be erased, folded into the crushing, fluid gravity that now hovered just inches above the pavement. Time compressed, the seconds feeling like heavy stones dropping into a deep well. WYRMSCALE stepped over a discarded briefcase, the strap still hooked around a ghost of a hand. There was no room for hesitation. The hum in the ground increased in pitch, signaling that the anchors were beginning to fray under the atmospheric strain. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown toward total structural collapse. If the sink was lost, the local reality would simply cease to exist, rewritten by the overwhelming pressure above. A new presence rippled through the static, a rhythmic pulse that didn't belong to the ocean or the earth. WYRMSCALE froze as a drone, sleek and unrecognizable, descended through the cloud bank, its sensors sweeping the lot with a cold, blue light. This was not a rescue mission, it was a harvest. Someone else was monitoring the tether points, waiting for the anchors to snap so they could claim the raw, displaced energy. The conflict was no longer just against the environment, but against a watching shadow. WYRMSCALE knelt, prying a panel from the base of a light pole to expose the emergency override. Tucked within the wiring was a physical key, a jagged piece of obsidian engraved with the coordinates of the tower's original foundation. It was the undeniable proof required to verify the frequency of the anchors. This stone was the key to the entire operation, a tangible reminder that catastrophe had been engineered by design, leaving behind a paper trail written in the language of geology and high-energy physics. The obsidian key pulsed when held against the vibrating concrete, the carvings glowing with an internal, amber light. It acted as a tuning fork, revealing the true orientation of the hidden dampeners. WYRMSCALE verified the alignment. The anchors were not just holding the ground in place, they were actively funneling the ocean pressure downward, creating a vacuum that threatened to draw the entire parking lot into the abyss. The proof was conclusive. The system was designed to collapse, to fold the local space into the sea. The drone hovered closer, its camera lens narrowing to track the glowing key. It was immediately at the impending rear. Whispers drifted through the static, a chorus of voices from the periphery, observers, or perhaps operators, waiting for the final fracture. WYRMSCALE stood, closing a fist around the obsidian. The secret of the tower was no longer isolated. It was a contested point, and as the clouds descended further, it became clear that the architect was finally coming to collect the debt. The air near the rusted bus stop frame curdled into a thick, translucent membrane. Behind it, a wall of ocean water stood perpendicular to the asphalt, suspended in a frozen, silent roar. WYRMSCALE stepped forward, boots crunching on broken glass, and met the gaze of the architect. There was no grandeur in their appearance, only the chilling indifference of a curator surveying a collection destined for the kiln. The horizon had vanished, replaced by the crushing weight of an ocean that refused to fall. WYRMSCALE held out the jagged obsidian fragment, its surface pulsing with the same rhythmic static as the encroaching tide. It was the physical manifest of the collapse, a condensed ledger of the atmospheric divide's structural failures. The architect watched the stone, not with surprise, but with the weary recognition of an author correcting a minor typo. Every vein within the rock mapped the exact coordinates of the suburb's erasure. The evidence did not plead for mercy. It simply stated the cost of the architect's grand design. The wall of water surged, a tremor of intent that threatened to snap the local gravity. WYRMSCALE pressed the obsidian into the base of the bus stop's metal support, forcing the stone to bridge the gap between the mundane infrastructure and the dimensional rift. It was an act of inverse tethering, attempting to ground the liquid sky by pinning it to the geography of the street. The static wailed, a shrill protest of physics grinding against geometry, as the anchor began to siphon the overwhelming pressure into the earth. A sickening vibration rippled through the pavement as the architect's construct faltered. The wall of water, no longer supported by the architect's singular will, began to buckle. It was not a violent collapse, but a graceful, terrifying folding of space that pulled the architect inward. They reached out, not to fight, but to steady the fraying edges of their own existence, caught in the undertow of a catastrophe they had carefully calibrated to erase everything else. The cost of their ambition had finally come due. WYRMSCALE felt the sudden vacuum pull at their own lungs, a psychic recoil from the anchor's activation. To stabilize the suburb of the eternal, the geometry of the obsidian had to be shattered, and the post was exactly into the surrounding reality. The sky flickered, losing its color as if the light itself were being rationed to pay for the stillness. Every breath taken in the aftermath felt borrowed, thin, and metallic, a reminder that the void had been held back only by a desperate sacrifice of substance. The architect vanished into the settling tide, their silhouette dissolving into the spray that now wept from the edges of the atmosphere. The pressure dissipated, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy. The water did not flood the streets, it simply evaporated, leaving the pavement scorched and covered in a fine, crystalline dust. The logic of the collapse had corrected itself, devouring its creator to fulfill the equation. WYRMSCALE stood alone in the center of the road, watching the last of the static fade. Morning light returned with a dull, bruised hue. WYRMSCALE knelt by the bus stop, sweeping the fine, salty dust from the bench with a bare hand. The metal of the frame remained warped, a permanent scar from the pressure of the ocean that had stood there hours before. It was slow, tedious work, removing the remnants of the event. Every movement was mechanical, devoid of triumph, focused entirely on restoring the utility of a place that no longer felt entirely grounded in the familiar world. There was a hollowness in the air that no amount of cleaning could fill. The horizon line had been permanently altered, a jagged tear in the sky that would never quite heal. WYRMSCALE looked at the empty space where the tower had loomed, realizing that while the suburbs survived, the version of the world that existed before the breach was gone, dissolved into the ether. Some things were simply lost to the scale of the event, untethered and drifted into the vast, silent spaces left behind. WYRMSCALE knelt on the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, her fingers tracing the jagged outline where the tower's foundation had anchored itself. Beside her, Elias gathered the discarded copper conduits, his movements deliberate and stripped of urgency. They did not speak of the architecture that had vanished into the clouds above, nor of the lives that had been folded into the geometry of the breach. Instead, she sorted the salvaged bolts, accepting that the heat of their shared history had cooled into a functional, quiet necessity for survival. The clock on the dashboard flickered at 4 in the morning, casting a pale, rhythmic pulse over the dashboard of the idling truck. WYRMSCALE watched the horizon, where the clouds were no longer stagnant but shifting with an unnatural, heavy density. She turned the key, the engine groaning into life with a familiar, mechanical protest. Her new routine demanded the clearing of debris from the perimeter, a task that replaced the void with the simple, grinding friction of gravel under heavy tires and the relentless, creeping frost to bond. She parked the vehicle near the rusted fence line, walking the path where the static had once distorted the very air. A stray dog darted through the gaps in the fence, trailing a piece of frayed, iridescent cable that refused to lose its unnatural glow. WYRMSCALE reached out to grasp the leash, but the animal dissolved into the tall, gray grass of the field. The tether was gone, and with it, the last phantom of a promise she had made before the sky tore open and swallowed the horizon. From the center of the asphalt expanse, the ground felt thinner, as if the earth were merely a veneer stretched over an infinite, hollow depth. WYRMSCALE stood perfectly still, watching the clouds descend until they brushed the pavement, obscuring the lines of the parking spaces. There was no terror in the encroaching white, only the realization that the weight of the world had shifted. She folded her arms against the sudden, biting chill, observing the way the mist consumed the concrete, turning the solid ground into a threshold for something vast and entirely indifferent. The silence that followed the departure of the tower was absolute, a soundless pressure that filled the lungs rather than the ears. WYRMSCALE picked up a heavy wrench, its cold steel grounding her as she stepped toward the edge of the lot where the asphalt simply ceased to exist. Beyond the boundary, the air rippled, a translucent curtain marking the divide between the known and the incomprehensible. She left the tool on the pavement, a small, iron monument to a life that no longer required the artifice of repair or the pretense of permanence.